There was a time when lard was in every American kitchen. Not in some kitchens, not in certain regions. Every kitchen. It sat in a can by the stove. It's what you fried your eggs in. What did you make your pie crusts with? What you used when a recipe called for fat. And now, it's treated like dangerous food. Something only grandparents used. Something you'd never cook with unless you didn't know better. But here's the thing. Lard didn't disappear because people cooked wrong. It disappeared because fat became political. So what happened? Why was lard the default fat for generations of Americans, and then suddenly wasn't? And why did it go from standard to almost unthinkable in just a few decades? If you want to understand how food narratives shift, hit subscribe, because this one's a wild ride. Let's start with what lard actually was in American kitchens. It wasn't a specialty ingredient. It wasn't something you sought out at fancy stores or used for special occasions. It was just what you cooked with. Because lard was cheap. Really cheap. If your family raised pigs, which a lot of families did, you got lard for free. It came with the animal. You rendered it yourself from the fat, stored it in a jar or a can, and used it all year. And even if you didn't raise pigs, lard was still the most affordable fat you could buy. It was available everywhere. It worked for everything. Frying, baking, sautéing, greasing pans. You didn't need 5 different oils for 5 different purposes. You just needed lard, and it worked. Pie crusts came out flaky. Fried chicken came out crispy. Biscuits came out tender. Lard wasn't special. It was standard. Nobody thought twice about it. Nobody questioned it. It's just what fat was. The same way we think of olive oil or vegetable oil today, that's how people thought of lard. It was the baseline, the default, the thing you didn't have to justify using, because everyone else was using it too. Here's what's important to understand about how people chose cooking fats back then. They didn't ask, "Is this healthy?" They asked, "Does this work?" And lard worked incredibly well. It had a high smoke point, which meant you could fry things at high heat without it breaking down or tasting burnt. It had a neutral flavor. It didn't make your pie crust taste like pork. It didn't overpower your vegetables. It just did its job quietly, and it lasted. You could store lard at room temperature for months, and it wouldn't go rancid. No refrigeration needed. So, from a purely functional standpoint, lard was nearly perfect. But nobody called it heart-healthy. Nobody marketed it as natural or clean. Because those weren't the questions people were asking yet. You used lard because it was affordable, reliable, and versatile. That was the entire calculation. Health wasn't part of the equation. Not because people didn't care about their health, but because the connection between cooking fat and heart disease hadn't entered the conversation yet. Food was fuel. Fat makes food taste better and cook properly. And lard did both of those things better than almost anything else you could afford. So it stayed in the kitchen. Unquestioned. Unremarkable. Just there. There's another layer to this that matters. Lard wasn't just something you bought. For a lot of families, it was something you made. If you raised pigs or if you bought a pig from someone local, you didn't just get the meat. You got everything. The organs, the bones, the fat, and the fat, you rendered it. You cut it into pieces, heated it slowly until the fat melted out, strained it, and stored it. It took time. It caught attention. But it wasn't complicated. It was just one of those things you did. Because wasting fat would have been wasteful. And waste wasn't really an option. Every part of the animal had value. The meat fed you, the bones made broth, the fat became lard. That wasn't frugality in the judgmental sense. It was just responsibility. You used what you had. You made it last. You didn't throw things away that could still serve a purpose. Rendering lard was part of that logic. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't fun. But it was normal. And because so many people made their own lard, it stayed embedded in how households operated. It wasn't just a product. It was a byproduct, a natural result of the way people lived. And that made it feel permanent. So, when did lard stop being acceptable? It started in the 1950s and 60s when scientists began studying heart disease, and what they found, or what they thought they found, was a connection between saturated fat and cholesterol. Lard is high in saturated fat. So is butter. So are a lot of animal fats. And the message that came out of that research was, saturated fat is bad for your heart. Now, the actual science was more complicated than that. There were debates, there were nuances, there were questions about other factors, sugar, processed foods, lifestyle, but nuance didn't survive headlines. What survived was, animal fat causes heart disease. And once that became the story, lard didn't stand a chance. It didn't matter that people had been cooking with it for generations. It didn't matter that it worked well. It didn't even matter whether the science was being interpreted correctly. What mattered was that doctors started saying it. Newspapers started printing it, and people started worrying. Because heart disease was, and still is, terrifying. So when the message became, the fat you've been using could kill you, people listened. Not because they wanted to stop using lard, but because they were scared not to. But science alone didn't kill lard. Marketing did. Because right around the same time that saturated fat was being villainized, vegetable oil companies saw an opportunity. Corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, margarine. These products had been around for a while, but they'd never been able to compete with lard on price or performance. But now, they had something better than price. They had a story. Heart healthy, cholesterol free, made from plants, not animals. The messaging was everywhere, in magazines, on TV, at the doctor's office, and it worked. Because people weren't just being told that lard was bad, they were being told that there was a better option, a modern option, a responsible option. Vegetable oil became the smart choice, the forward-thinking choice. And lard? Lard became the thing your grandparents used because they didn't know any better. So lard didn't just get abandoned, it got replaced by products that were cheaper to produce at scale, that had longer shelf lives, that could be marketed as part of a healthy, modern lifestyle. And once that switch happened, there was no going back. Because it wasn't just about cooking anymore. It was about what kind of person you were. What kind of family were they raising? And nobody wanted to be the person still cooking with dangerous fat. And this is where something deeper happened, something that went beyond just switching one ingredient for another. Cooking became moralized. Before you chose lard because it worked, it was practical, functional. No one judged you for it. But once fat became tied to health, and health became tied to responsibility, suddenly every choice in the kitchen carried weight. If you cooked with lard, you were being careless, reckless, putting your family at risk. If you switched to vegetable oil, you were being smart, informed, a good parent. Food stopped being neutral, and people started cooking out of fear instead of function. Not fear of the food tasting bad. Fear of doing the wrong thing. Fear of being the person who didn't know better. Fear of being blamed if something went wrong. That's a very different kind of pressure. And once that fear set in, lard didn't just lose its place in the kitchen. It lost its innocence. It became something you had to justify, defend, explain. And most people didn't want to do that. So they quietly switched. Not because vegetable oil worked better, but because it felt safer. Safer from judgment, safer from guilt, safer from the creeping worry that maybe you were doing something harmful without realizing it. Cooking became moralized, and lard became the casualty. But here's what's interesting. Lard didn't actually disappear. It just went underground. In Mexican-American kitchens, lard never left. Tamales, refried beans, tortillas. Lard stayed because it was tied to tradition, to flavor, to identity. In Southern cooking, the same thing. Biscuits, fried chicken, cornbread. People kept using it quietly because that's how those foods were supposed to taste. And in recent years, it started coming back in other places too. Artisan bakers, farm-to-table restaurants, people who care about sourcing and sustainability. But here's the difference. It's not coming back because people are poor or because they have no other option. It's coming back because people are choosing it. Intentionally. Because science has gotten more nuanced. Because people started questioning whether vegetable oils were actually better. Because natural started to mean something different than it did in the 1970s. Lard is being reconsidered. Not by everyone, not everywhere, but enough that it's no longer automatic shame to admit you cook with it. And that's interesting, because it means the story can change again. Not back to what it was, but into something new, where lard isn't the default, but it's also not the enemy. It's just an option. Lard didn't disappear because it was bad at its job. It disappeared because the story around it changed. From essential to dangerous. From standard to shameful. And that shift didn't happen because of taste, or performance, or even science, really. It happened because fear is a better motivator than function. And once people became afraid of fat, not just lard, but the whole idea of it, the choice became easy. But stories don't stay fixed forever. We've already seen liver disappear and partially return. Oxtail gets redefined. Stula sees its place and gain new meaning. And now, lard is quietly finding its way back into some kitchens. Not all, but some. Because the fear is fading, the narrative is shifting. And people are starting to ask different questions again. Not, is this safe? But, is this real? If this kind of story makes you think, hit subscribe, because we're mapping how food narratives rise and fall. And leave a comment. What food do we fear today that future generations might quietly bring back? I'll see you in the next one.